practice more with color. So we are going to continue with our little color paintings so we just get more practice. But before we do that, I just want to go over underpaintings. I promised you we'd do that, which we were going to do today, but it's not a big deal. So could we go to the slideshow really quick? Just 1 second. We're going to switch to the slideshow so you guys can see. And we're on lesson 4. I wish I could tell you the slide number. Okay, so lesson 4 is underpainting. So what an underpainting is basically a color underneath. So you're not painting on white. Now there's several approaches to underpaintings. Some people don't like to use them. Some like to do like on this slide where you have values, which this is personally my favorite way. But it kind of depends on how complicated of a painting I'm doing. Another way is to just do a solid color and not do anything fancy, just a solid color underneath. So this example here, this is by Kenneth Hersherson. And the way that you do this is you take your color that you're going to underneath. So this, a very, very common color to go underneath is our burnt sienna, which you guys have in your painting set. So you take it and put on your palette, and you know how we added the gamma sol to loosen the paint before? We do that, but we do that a little bit more. And if you've ever stained wood, like stained furniture, it's very similar. So you brush it on and then you wipe it off with a paper towel. And what that does is it tints the canvas, but it's not like super thick. And then from there, you can use a kneaded eraser and you can erase out the lights, and you can take your burnt sienna and you can paint in the darker areas. And that will give you 3 separate values to better understand your painting. Now, we're not really going to worry about this for this class just for time's sake. But if you want to, you're welcome to just tone the canvas a color. That's a great way to start with practicing underpainting, so you can see what that does for your painting. So it's, some people wonder, what is the point, right? What it does is, so if there's spots on your painting where the background comes through a little bit, then a color is coming through and it can add more depth and dimension to your painting. If we flip back to my camera, this one, can we flip back to this one? I just want to show you, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera, but you can kind of see orange peeking through there. That's from my underpainting. So like from a distance, you're not necessarily going to see it, but when you look up close, it kind of just gives it a little more dimension. It makes it a little bit more interesting. Now, I love underpainting. I will always do an underpainting under mine because I think it just adds something a little extra. I'm going to show this to you guys so you can see it up close. Can you see it? All right. So that's what underpainting is. There's the common colors. Burnt sienna we talked about. Sometimes you'll see yellow, but that's not very common. That's a more difficult color to work with. But oftentimes the ultramarine blue, or I'm trying to remember other ones. The mainly you see like burnt sienna and like ultramarine blue, depending on what you want to happen in your painting. If you did a blue underpainting, it might make your overall painting feel cooler, like more cold, like just the color temperature of it. So if you were doing a winter scene, that might be a good option to put the blue underneath. So today then, we're going to go straight to our color paintings. Now I'd like to get a vote. Would you like me to continue with this one that we started last time? Or would you like me to switch and walk through this one? So grapes or oranges? If everyone could kind of tell me their vote, let me know which one to work on the camera. You guys okay? Okay, if your other libraries in the chat or whatever, if you just tell me your vote, we'll find out.
Oranges for Cokeville.
Cokeville votes oranges. Okay. So far, oranges is in the lead. Okay, I'm going to start with oranges. If anyone has a different opinion, just let me know. Oh, we have a vote for grapes. So now we're tied. We need a tiebreaker. Camera, I think it's up to you. Oh, you see the other one. Okay, so what I'll do then is I'll continue with oranges. Oh, there's grape. Okay, so then I will start with grapes, and then if there's time, I'll switch and do some of the oranges. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and switch to my desktop camera. You guys just have to tell me if you can't see. I tried to get it so I could show as much as possible. All right, so if everyone can get out their paint, I kind of assume everyone's somewhat set up. So pull out your paints, get out your brushes. You want your gamma salt, just our normal setup like we've been doing. I'm looking at my palette and I can see that I don't have very much red. So I'm just going to refill that. Oh, and I'm switching grapes. So while you are getting set up, I'm just going to start drawing the grapes picture. Now remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. This is for practice, just like last time, because color is hard and it can be frustrating. So we're going to quickly draw the picture on. So while you're getting set up, I'm going to start drawing that. I'm not at a very good angle for drawing right now, so if this doesn't look very good, that's why. This isn't perfect. I obviously have it too close to the edge and stuff, but I'm not worrying about that for this. I just want to practice so I know what colors that I want to do. So we're not doing an underpainting today. So, because if we did an underpainting, that's another thing I should mention. When you do an underpainting, you want to use charcoal, especially if it's your final painting. Graphite technically doesn't work well with oil paint. For this, it doesn't matter because we're just practicing. But when we do our final and we transfer our drawings, we will use charcoal. So if you're doing an underpainting, you can either draw your image first and then tone it, or you can tone it and draw on top. But either way, you need to use charcoal if you're doing on a final painting because it doesn't affect the color.
So if you draw first and tone it, so over drawing.
Yes, so the question is, if you draw your picture first and then go over it for your underpainting, yes, you can do that. With graphite, if you do that, it will just wipe away your drawing. Now, I've found for me personally, I'm always really nervous, but if I draw with my charcoal and I go over it, it might wipe a little bit, but it usually stays on fairly well. So that's if you're nervous about that, then I would tone it first, and after it's dried a little bit, then you could draw on top. So if you're nervous, I would do it that way. But that's a great thing to experiment with. If you draw it first, I've been successful drawing it first and then toning over it myself. Another option is to not draw it at all and just draw it with your paint on there. It's not like you have to have an actual drawing underneath, but it's helpful, especially if it's a really technical painting. It is helpful. Did that make sense? That's only if we're doing an underpainting. Today, we're not going to do that. We're just doing what we did last time. I just wanted to tell you about underpaintings. So in the future, if you want to try it, you're welcome to. But for time, we're just going to practice our colors today. Yeah. Yeah. So it's up to you if you want to. We have a student here who is going to just draw the oranges and just practice on the oranges. That's totally fine. I want you to get a feel. This is for practice. So if you want to zoom in on a certain part of a painting or whatever, that's totally great. For our final, we'll be doing the whole composition. But if you want to zoom in on that to practice, that's fine. Especially where we're doing 2 days of practice on this. Whatever you feel you need to practice on, that's great. Well, this isn't very good, and it doesn't have to be good for this. Okay, as soon as everyone is ready to start mixing paint, just let me know and we'll get started. But I want to give you enough time to do your little drawing first so you don't feel like you're trying to catch up. Good, Lincoln is ready. Am I right? remember, if you don't want to paint the grape one and you want to work on the orange one, that is totally fine. The grape one is just what I'm going to focus on today. Yes, so just to review from last time, I use a limited palette, which I use my red, yellow, and blue, and burnt sienna. And I also, if I was painting like at home, you guys don't have all these colors, but I would have like a warmer version of blue and a colder version of red, just to help me control temperature. But other than that, those are all the only colors that I use. You do have green and a couple other colors in your set that if you want to try those, you are welcome to. I won't be showing those being mixed, but if you want to try those, by all means. That's how you get it, is experimenting with the colors that you have. So is Jane and Alpine and Cokeville, are you guys ready yet? Oh, there's a thumbs up. And Zane says they're ready. Alpine, are you ready? There's a thumbs up. Okay. All right. So I told you last time that if you were doing the grapes, that you got a little bit of a cheat on your background color, because all the background color is on this one is burnt sienna and some white. Now I like this background because I did more texture on it. So all these are really just burnt sienna. The lighter areas might have a little bit of white in them, but if you can tell, it's really strokey, and I like that myself. I like some texture in there. So on the background, we don't need a little teeny tiny brush. It depends on the size of your canvas, though. If you're doing a bigger canvas, you'll want a bigger brush because that will cover more area. If you're using a smaller canvas, you'll want a brush that matches basically, but one that will cover the background fairly quickly. For mine, I'm going to use this brush, which my brushes are different than yours now, but this is about the size that I'm using. My canvas is a little bigger than your guys's this time too. So I'm just going to get some burnt sienna, and it's pretty thick. So we're going to loosen it like we've been talking about. And we're just going to put it on the background. And burnt sienna, because it's kind of I call it a staining color. It doesn't necessarily go on super even and opaque. It's kind of transparent. That's what helps me get the strokiness and texture. Now, if I want a part to be darker or lighter, I can add a little bit of white if I want to have some lighter areas or more opaque areas. Oh yeah, did not work. Can you guys hear me? Trying to put the mic in a good spot. Is that better? Oh, I lost my head. Okay, hopefully that's better. Hopefully you guys can hear me. So I'm cutting in my edges. It is okay to overshoot your edges a little bit so that when you go back with that next color, you can have a nice edge with no white peeking through, unless you want white peeking. Now remember, you don't have to do the whole background on this because we're just figuring out the colors. Sometimes I will go through with one color and then I'll go back and add darks and lights. Oh, I'm always trying to figure out where you guys can see the painting. So I typically try to avoid black. That isn't a good way to darken colors when you need, but I always try to do that as a last resort. Burnt sienna on its own is pretty dark, so I can darken it a lot with just that. Because black also takes a lot of the color out of things, and so I try to avoid it until I absolutely need to. Now that I've done kind of like my flat color, it does look pretty orange if you can see the difference. So this is where I'll start adding my darks with my just plain burnt sienna. And then if it's not dark enough, then I will add a little bit of black. But I try not to. It's kind of like building it up in layers. And I'm putting it on in more strokey motions, which is what helps to give it that texture. Now, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. And don't forget, in between your handle, it's easy to forget those little places. So now I'm to the point where I want to add a little bit of black. Now a little bit of black goes a long way. See how I just added a little and it's so dark now. Yep. I used a little bit of white there. It's basically sienna and white and black. I just always caution, be careful with black. I tried to find headphones that would keep my little headphones in my ears, and my pair was broken. So my headphones are still going to be falling out. The background can be fun because it's so like free, and you can do it however you want. Texture or no texture. Now in the foreground, the floor of the painting, this I just did the same color, but it's just with white, right? So I'm just gonna squeeze out, because I have black in there. I'll just kind of squeeze that paint out of my brush, and I'll go back to this white version. Now remember, these are base colors. So if you can see, it still looks a little different. That's because I went back later and added more to it, because I made this a little bit more finished than what we're necessarily going for with our practice. So it is still very orange. So what could we do to make it a little less orange other than add black? Does anybody know? Do you remember? Yes,
You add blue?
compliment. We had that here, the answer here said add blue, which is the complement, which will tone down the oranginess. I'm putting these little darks in here just because I'm wanting to remember that there's shadows. So I'm going to show you, if I touch the blue just a little bit and I mix it in there, it immediately makes it more brown. The brown is basically orange and blue. We can see the difference of that. Okay, when everyone says they're ready again, I'll move on to a different color. So the question is, should we worry about brush strokes showing? So that is your choice. On the background, especially, I like to have my brush stroke showing because I just love that texture. I think it looks really good. If you don't like that, you're welcome to do it as smooth as you want. It's your choice. There's different kinds of paintings that look really strokey, look like you can see a lot of their brush stroke, and some where you can't see any. So that's a personal preference of how you want to do it. This is scratching my nose. Okay, we're looking at all the screens right now. So when you are ready to move on to the next color, just give us a thumbs up. Great, Alpine, we see you.
We have a question here.
Okay.
I'm just going to let you state that for Bill.
On your canvas, when you're painting, sometimes you can see the texture of the paint. I mean, text canvas kind of looks like you're looking at it through a screen door. How can do you thicken your paint or paint over it, or how do you get rid of that the little squares from the canvas underneath it? Does that make sense?
Okay, so the question is, how do you not see the texture of the white canvas underneath? So that usually happens if your paint is a little thick. Sometimes it won't spread into those holes very well. So you can thin it a little more and it will go into those holes, or just going over it several times. You might really have to push with your paintbrush to push it into those holes. But that's pretty common. That's one thing that happens. That's a good reason for doing an underpainting, is because when that happens, then it's a color showing through and not white. Does that make sense? I hope that answered your question.
All right, go ahead and say that again, Bill.
You just taught an old dog new tricks.
I didn't quite hear that.
You just taught an old dog new tricks.
Oh, well, good.
Thank
You
you.
just said we just had an old dog. Okay, it's looking like everyone's pretty much ready to go on to the next color. So last time we focused a lot on the other painting on the lighter color for the pot. So on this one, I'm going to start with the grape color. Well, we kind of did that actually last time, didn't we? I'll kind of show that again a little bit because I still have it here. So in between colors, I like to just scrape them. If there's enough of a color, I'll make a little pile like we did last week. Okay, so last week we mixed this color right here for our middle value of our grapes. So I'm actually going to switch to a smaller paintbrush because the grapes are smaller. So what we did was we mixed purple and we lined it with white, and then we added, we toned it down. We added some yellow, we added some gray till we got it to here. Now looking at it now, I almost want it to have a little bit more red. So I'm just gonna add a little bit more red to that. And this is going to be my middle value for my grapes. So for me, it's easier to paint the grape one color and then add the details. So, I mean, obviously, we don't have to add details right now because this is just an experiment.
Like take to the dark value first.
I go in the middle. So the question was, do you start with darker and then go lighter, or start with lighter and go darker? My answer is the middle. I like to go in the middle because I have a nice place to start. I can add dark, I can add light, and it usually works out pretty well. So I colored in a grape. Now, if you notice, this looks a lot different than mixing it on the palette than it looks on my canvas. So if I'm not satisfied how it looks on the canvas, then you should change it. What matters is how it's relating with your painting on the canvas. So I'm just going to grab a little more blue because I feel like it's not purple enough. I'm just going to adjust it. Paint mixing is all about little adjustments. So you mix a middle value. So when I look at the grapes, I would be aiming to mix somewhere in here. And then I can add the darks and add the lights on top of it. So I changed the purple that I did a little bit. I guess I'll do it down here. Now I'm personally not loving these purples, so I might actually just start over and mix that again. Okay, but that's good to compare. So you can see this one's a little more red. I think what happened was I probably got too much gray and we lost a lot of the color. And that happens. If you ever feel like you need to start over mixing a color, that's totally fine. It's better to remix and have a good color than keep going with a bad one because it will affect your final painting. Well, this one won't because we're practicing, but so I've got red and blue because red and blue make purple. So this, because this is red, I don't remember if I added yellow or not actually, but I think I might have. It just depends on what I'm doing. Intuition. The question is, why would I add yellow or some random color, seemingly random color, to a color? And that is intuition and experience. That's why we're doing this, is to practice and get familiar with your colors. And the more you are, the more you'll be like, oh, if I add a tiny bit of this, it might do this to my color. So if I wanted it to be a little warmer, I would add a little bit of yellow because it will mix with the red and be a little bit orange. So if you add a color next to it on the color wheel, it should make the color a little more intense if you haven't lost a lot of your color already. But so that would be a reason to add yellow, just like we would add the complement to tone down the colors. So that's a dark purple. So I'm going to lighten it up a little bit. So white, if you remember, tends to make things a little bit chalky, meaning it kind of makes the colors not as vibrant. That doesn't look too different, but I'm actually still liking it better. I always like to hold it up on my palette knife and compare. the question is, do I always work from a picture? And the answer is no. In my current situation where I have little kids at home and stuff, I can't always go outside and paint or, set up a still life and have it not be knocked over. So currently I do paint a lot from pictures, but I always recommend painting from life. That is the best practice. It is also the hardest because you have to interpret and there's movement. So it is good to work from pictures when you need to, but I always, if you can practice and get good at painting from life, you're that much better. It's a really great skill, and you will get better paintings because you're not limited by what the camera can do. You're actually using your eyes to interpret the scene and not relying on the camera. Because that's a really tempting thing, is to rely on the camera. But if you can understand what's happening and what the camera is doing or what's actually happening in nature, then it's that much better. And the more you paint from life, then even when you have to paint from a photo, you'll understand more what's happening and you'll still be better because then you're not relying on the camera. Because cameras tend to make shadows darker than they are. You lose a lot of detail in the shadows, especially. So yes, painting from life is recommended. So it's not always super easy to do. Okay. So sometimes when my colors are wet, I like to mix a little bit on the canvas. You do not have to do this, but sometimes like I have my base color and I'm like, well, I want a little bit there to be a little bit redder. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but it can even mix a little bit on the canvas. Let me see if I can show you. I don't know if you can see that. Just mixed a little bit of red in there. I actually still have a lot of liquid on my brush, so I'm gonna squeeze that out a little more. I did it a little more extreme, so hopefully you could see. So that's actually too much, but I was just trying to show you. Let me try again on this other one. Yeah, so you do want to add white, but you just need to keep in mind if it makes it chalky, you might have to adjust a little more. So even though white might make it chalky, you still got to figure out how to lighten it and add other, like, more color to it. You just got to keep in mind that that happens so you can account for it. Right. Always be cautious with your colors. So I'm going to take a little bit of my dark, which I mixed last time, which was just the red and the blue. I'm not at a super great angle, so this painting is not going to be very good, but I'm just kind of adding some of those dark. So I want you to experiment with that. Experiment with darks and adding different colors and see what happens. Now, if you try to add your lights, you might notice that it doesn't work super well when it's wet. That might be something you have to add with either really thick paint or wait for it to dry a little bit. So that's like a thick adding, but obviously we don't want it to be that bright. See how it's starting to take shape? Now, granted, this isn't a very good example. I'm not doing a very good job today, but it's starting to take shape and look round. That's because we're adding values to it. Any questions so far?
Very fine point.
So the question is, am I using a fine point brush? My brush, I don't know. I don't think you guys have one this size. It's not necessarily fine point. It's just smaller. So it looks like it's a filbert.
Like a chisel brush, but that's all.
It's actually a filbert, so that's a little bit more rounded. So it's softer. The chisel ones are the ones that are like square, like this. So I'm using a little bit more rounded one. Yeah, there's no rule on like you have to use a certain brush. You can probably use a flat one and get the same look.
Do I need to make sure that my edges are crisp right at first or no?
Not necessarily. So the question is, do you need to make your edges crisp? That's kind of up to you. If you keep in mind though that edges will affect how things look in comparison to each other. So soft edges generally look like they're going farther in the background, where harder edges tend to come towards you more. So maybe the things that are closer to you, you might want to have a harder edge. A harder edge means like a really clear separation. I think we talked about this last time. Versus a soft edge, which is like more of a gradient in between the colors. See this, where I have these white spots going through? That's called a halo. And generally you don't want that. Now, if you had an underpainting, that wouldn't matter so much. But that's why I usually say it's okay to overshoot the edge of your drawing when you're doing like your background or whatever, because then that doesn't happen. But I'm not going to take the time to fix it right now. I'm basically just painting in all my grapes that solid color. Okay, so for this painting, where we're just practicing, my goal here was to figure out my base color, my shadow color for the grapes, and my highlight, or kind of just making a plan. Now, I don't necessarily need to go through and paint every grape. You're welcome to, and that's, we're here to practice. But notice how things work, like where this is a little more wet, it's harder to add those extra colors, but it's really easy to blend. Notice when you need to squeeze paint out of your brush or different things like that. Now, I feel like this is a kind of a dull purple. I want to add extra reds in there on the canvas just so it doesn't look so dull, because grapes really have a lot of variation in their color, and we want them to look not just flat. Some of these I'm gonna use some of that other purple a little bit. Now, there are some things we know, like we know the light is coming from this direction, and so the darks are going to be on this side and the lights are going to be up here. But it's nice to keep referring to your reference. So if there's any variations or anything different, that you can make sure that you're not getting generic with your strokes or what you're doing. You want to make sure you're kind of keeping true to nature and not relying too much on what you know. You got to rely also on what you see. Okay, I'm going to give you a few more minutes to work on your grapes, and when you're ready, we'll move on and we'll practice mixing some greens for the pear. So if anyone wants to show their work and their progress so far, feel free. We love to see it. Anyone going to be brave and show their work today?
Kaylee,
Yes.
Cokeville has some that we'd like to show you.
Great. I'd love to see. Oh, look how good. That's looking great.
They look like peaches.
They don't look like peaches. They look great.
Okay, we have one more.
Very good. I like the values on your vase. Very good. Thank you, Cokeville. Okay. Sorry, if no one else wants to show, I'll just go ahead and move on to the next color. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, I see some thumbs up. Great. Okay, so I always like to clean my brushes between major colors. So remember, you really kind of have to push and really work your paintbrush to get that paint out. And you can see when it's clean enough to move on. Now there are special jars that they make that have metal coils in them. So you fill up with your Gamasol and then you can rub your brush on the metal coils. And it's really effective at getting the paint out of the brush. So if you ever start oil painting more regularly, that would probably be a good thing. So I got most of that out. I'm going to also clean my other one. So greens can be really tricky because there's so much variation in green. There's blue greens, we added red to green before when we were doing the background on the other one. There's just a lot that you can do to green. So we're going to look at the reference. So I chose to have some kind of yellow and orangey green. That, how can you have an orangey green? I don't know how to explain it, but that's what I call that. And then I have some blues in the shadow side. So generally I'll mix like my light color and my dark color, and then I kind of tweak in between. So how do we mix green, yellow, and blue? So remember, mixing colors is always just adjustments. So if we take this color, which is green, and we compare it, I don't know if you can see it. It looks super dark, but this is actually a really bright green. It's like almost neon. And so obviously we need to do some changing, right? So I'm going to start by adding white. And I'm just going to kind of mix over to the side a little bit because I kind of want to keep this base green because I have a dark green that I'm working with too. Now in this case, letting the green be a little chalky isn't necessarily bad because it is a pretty intense green and we don't want it to be that intense. Okay, so now I have this light green value. I compare and it's still quite intense. So we tweak it again. I'm going for more of a yellow green on the light side, so I'm going to add more yellow. And it was also a little bit darker in value, so I'm going to add a little bit more white. I just feel like it's not quite light enough yet. Sorry, my palette keeps rocking back and forth. Now it's still very green compared to what I'm looking for. So what can I do? How can I make it less green, less vibrant? Yes, I'm going to add a little bit of red. Or you can add gray. And especially with a color like this, a little red is going to go a long ways. So this is even too much. So I'm going to push some of that off and just put a little bit of red in there. I know that sounds so scary. Adding the compliment is scary. But look what that did for our color. That's a much, much nicer green for our pear. Compare it again. And that looks pretty good. I hope you can see it on the screen, but it's pretty close. Now I have a little more variations in some of these colors, and I like to do that myself on the canvas. Not everyone likes to do it that way, and if you want to mix little variations of your colors, that's great. I just tend to like to do those little things on the canvas. So I'm going to I'm going to start with this little bit bigger brush because I want to cover more area. So I'm going to come over and putting it on my light side. Now, obviously, like we said before, my pear isn't drawn perfectly because I'm just worried about colors right now. That's a solid light green. But I want to experiment with my variations. So one, it's more orange in this area. I feel like that's kind of more realistic to how fruit can be. So I just touched my brush in my red just a little bit. And I see that was so much. So wipe it off a little bit. And just kind of work it in. And if I feel like it's a little bright, I can add more of my green on top. And we also have a little variation in value. So again, I can grab a little bit of white, mix in some of this green to make a step lighter. I'm going to actually add a little more yellow. So that I would even say is closer to yellow than to green, but it's made with this green, so the colors should harmonize together really well. And especially when you put it on when the paint is wet, you're going to get some variation in there. Okay, so now I'm going to take this color and mix a darker, bluer version. So you can work from the lighter color or you can come back to the dark color. I kind of saved it for that reason. Now I still have some of that other color on the back, and that doesn't bother me, you know. So, but I'm going to just start by just adding blue. Now blue, because it's a darker color anyways, it's immediately darkening the value. I like to really mix with what I have available because that makes your colors harmonize more together. If I look at that, it's a little intense. I'll probably add a little bit more blue. Darken it just a little more. Might go even a little more. Okay, so that's kind of, it's not exactly matching these colors, but I'm okay with that because I know that when I did this, some of these are a result of mixing with what was there. This is about, I know this is about where I want to be. I'm going to squeeze out my brush. And I'm going to paint in the shadow side. So have fun and experiment with strokes and what strokes you can see, or if you like it smooth. I just feel like, especially these organic things, the fruits and stuff, it's really fun to experiment with those on these because it's nature and it has more room for texture. If you notice, I turn my canvas a lot because I like to use my natural hinges in my hands and arms to get curves. Again, I like to add like little bits of red. In certain spots. And I know it looks super intense when you first put it on there, but that's the beauty of oil paint is it's really flexible and you can just blend it in and it gives you nice subtle variations. Now I'm mixing a little bit of blue and gray in here, kind of making it a little bit darker. There are some darker spots. I'm even going to touch my black just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit to get a little bit darker because I want a little bit more shape, and we do shape with value. On this one, we have a shadow from the stem. And that's a fun thing to do, but you don't necessarily have to. Again, this is just the practice. So. Is everyone doing okay with the green? Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. Would you guys like me to continue with this, or would you want me to switch to the oranges for a minute? Too late for oranges. Someone's. No, I'm sure they're. Oh, they look good. Can we show it? I really love the variation in there. They do look like oranges. This one? They do. I really like this. I'm going to show. You're so good. Thank you. Okay, I want to show you this. I love the reds and the browns in here. Look how good that looks. It's glaring a little bit, but those are some, it's a very natural orange color that looks really good. See that? Good job.
It's a work in progress.
All paintings are a work in progress. Oh, there we go. Yep, there's another. Oh, orange, please. Okay. Yes. Figuring out the fruit is the tricky part, which is why we're practicing. Okay, let me clear this off, and I'm going to show the orange. So to start, how do you make orange? What colors do you use? Good. And here we have the answer red and yellow. And that's exactly right. Now with orange, it's going to get muddy really fast. And what I mean by muddy is it's going to look dirty and gross. So we don't want to add a lot of complements or a lot of grays to our orange because it's going to go brown really fast. Okay, let me clean this off. Every color tends to act a little bit different. It's like they each have personalities. That sounds weird, but it's true. Different colors, they just behave different. Do we have the razor blade? Okay. So I'm pulling out this one. Oh, look, I got green all over. Okay. going to start with red and yellow. Red tends to be a stronger color than yellow, so you'll probably end up using more yellow than red. So that is a pretty intense orange, right? Which oranges are pretty intense, but it's a little bit bright. So to tone it down, we can use gray and we can use blue, which is fine, but just a tiny, tiny bit with orange. I'm going to show you. Added a little bit of blue. I mean, I barely touched that blue, and look at the difference. But also look at that orange. It's a bit more natural. Can you guys see? It's a little bit more natural, but that was just a tiny, tiny bit of blue, and that made a huge difference. So if I were to go lighter, so I kind of like this orange right here. I would probably use that. So if I'm going to go lighter for the lighter side of the orange, just little tiny bits at a time. So there's the lighter orange that I could use. Now to go darker, we are basically going to brown, but we want it to be a more red orange brown. So I'm just barely touching that blue. I'm gonna mix in. See how brown that is? So I can add a tiny bit more blue just because I want it darker. But as it goes brown, I'm also going to add a little more red to kind of keep it looking more orange so it doesn't look like rotten oranges, right? So as I added that red, it kind of kept that intensity up that the orange had. So that's a good, this isn't exactly shadow, but the more of a darker side of the orange. Orange is just really temperamental. It changes really quickly, really fast. So you just got to remember just tiny, tiny amounts to adjust it. So if I put that on my canvas, it'll look something like this. And this is a color that will mix more with your graphite as well. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so I hope that makes sense for those oranges. And on these, I like to, well, because orange kind of turns red in shadow and stuff. If it's looking dull, like I look at this and I'm like, it looks a little bit dull. So I'm gonna do the on canvas mixing thing that I did with the pear. I'm just taking a little bit of red and I'm just gonna put it on in a couple of areas, which just makes it look kind of overall brighter. Because if you remember, we said that if you add a color next to it, next to a color on the color wheel, it will make it more intense. And I don't know if you can see that, but that made a difference. And it went from looking dull oranges to bright oranges. Okay. We have about 5 minutes. So are there any more questions? And if you're ready, you could probably start cleaning up. Or if you have any more questions, I'd be happy to answer. Or if anyone wants to show their work, that would be great too. Okay, so next week, um, really quick. So next week we're going to start our big painting. So the plan is that we will transfer our drawings to our big canvas and we will start the block in, which I'll explain that next time. If you want to do an underpainting, you'd do that next time as well. So if you've been taking a drawing home to work on it or whatever, have it ready for next time because we'll need it first thing. Okay?
Thank you, Kayle. Thank you. Be safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.